Imagine waking up one morning to find black rain falling from the sky outside your window. Not metaphorical black rain, literal black rain. Oily, toxic, soaked in benzene, coating your car, your street, your children's school playground in thick chemical grime. That is exactly what happened to the residents of Tuapse, a Russian Black Sea resort town of 60,000 people, in late April 2026. And it happened because Ukraine's drone campaign against Russia's oil lifeline has now reached a scale and a depth that nobody in Moscow ever prepared for. This is not just a military story. This is the story of how a smaller nation with no air force to speak of 4 years ago has now constructed a weapon so precise, so relentless, and so economically devastating that it is literally changing the weather in Russian cities. And what happened after Ukraine struck? The panic, the cover-ups, the Kremlin's desperate spin, the residents who began publicly asking questions their government does not want to answer. That is the story that will define the next phase of this war. Let us start with the numbers that set the stage, because they are extraordinary. In 2024, oil and gas revenues accounted for 30% of Russia's total tax and export income, roughly $120 billion. That is the financial engine of Putin's war. Every tank rolling toward Ukrainian cities, every missile launched at civilian infrastructure, every soldier's salary paid in every occupied town, all of it runs on oil money. Ukraine identified this years ago. And in 2026, it stopped talking about it and started destroying it. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky stood up on May 1st, 2026, and announced something that should have dominated every news cycle on Earth. He said that Russia had lost at least $7 billion since the start of 2026 as a direct result of Ukrainian drone strikes on its oil sector. He called April a new level in the campaign. He pointed to declining Russian oil revenues, increased downtime at struck facilities, and disruptions to oil shipments that Russia's own logistics network was struggling to absorb. $7 billion in 4 months. From drones that Ukraine built with its own hands in converted factories under active wartime conditions. And those $7 billion represent a conservative estimate, because they only account for confirmed, documented losses. The actual disruption runs much deeper. Research conducted by Reuters in late March 2026 found that Ukrainian attacks on Russian port infrastructure had temporarily reduced Russia's oil export capacity by approximately 40%. An analysis of the energy sector confirmed that Russian oil exports fell 43% in just the week of March 22nd to 29, from 4.07 million barrels per day down to 2.32 million barrels per day, costing an estimated $1 billion in lost revenue in that single week alone. Russia's average oil refinery capacity dropped to 4.69 million barrels per day, the lowest level since December 2009, a 16-year low, not from Western sanctions, but from Ukrainian drones flying over 1,000 kilometers into Russian territory and hitting targets that the Kremlin told its people were completely safe. Now let us talk about Tuapse, because Tuapse is where the abstract strategic picture became brutally real for ordinary Russian citizens, and where the cracks in the Kremlin's narrative became impossible to paper over. The Rosneft-operated Tuapse oil refinery on Russia's Black Sea coast processes approximately 12 million tons of crude oil per year. It is one of Russia's most important petroleum export facilities in the south, handling refined products for both domestic consumption and foreign export. Ukraine had already struck it multiple times in late 2025. Industry analysts confirmed it was already effectively offline before the April 2026 campaign even began. And then Ukraine hit it again, and again, and again. The first strike came on April 16, 2026, starting a fire that burned for 4 days, before firefighters could fully declare it. Extinguished, Ukraine struck again on April 20th. That fire burned for 5 days. Smoke from that second fire was so thick, so toxic, and so sustained that analysis of air quality around Tuapse found concentrations of benzene, xylene, and soot at 3 times above safe levels. Russian health authorities advised residents to stay indoors, keep all windows sealed, and wear masks when venturing outside. Schools were closed. Public events were canceled from May 1st through May 11th, covering both Labor Day and Russia's Victory Day celebrations, the most politically charged national holiday of the year, during which Putin traditionally projects strength and triumph. Then came the black rain. Rainfall mixed with combustion byproducts from the burning refinery created a phenomenon that has only been seen historically in the most extreme industrial disasters in recorded history, after the atomic bombing of Hiroshima in 1945. After Kuwait's oil fields were deliberately ignited during the 1991 Gulf War, black water droplets, blackened by soot and ash, falling from the sky and coating everything they touched. Train carriages covered in dark residue, streets running with oily grime, cleanup volunteers arriving in hazmat-level conditions to find animals coated in the chemical fallout. One volunteer told Al Jazeera directly, Everything was covered in black grime. The smell was oily, and all of it was very toxic. On April 29th, Ukraine struck Tuapse again, for the third time in 12 days. A column of smoke rose so high it was compared by local time in 16 days. Local Russian officials scrambled to deploy more than 100 emergency personnel to battle the marine terminal fire. By that point, over 13,300 cubic meters of fuel oil and contaminated soil had already been removed from the coastline. An oil slick had formed in the Black Sea, raising concerns about marine pollution across the entire coastal ecosystem. The refinery had suspended operations indefinitely. Putin's initial response was telling. After the third strike, he was briefed by the regional governor and then told the Russian public, on live television, that there did not seem to be any serious threats, and that people were handling the challenges they faced on the spot. The governor posted a video of himself walking around Tuapse with smoke visibly billowing behind him, oil streaming down a street behind him, trying to project calm. Russia's consumer safety watchdog was simultaneously advising residents to drink only bottled water. These two messages, the Kremlin's reassurance and the environmental emergency unfolding in plain sight, were broadcast to the same population at the same time. And the population noticed the contradiction. One Tuapse resident wrote on social media that many people were in a depressed state, that there was nothing good to expect, and that the government response had been completely insufficient. Another resident posted publicly that the pollution would impact people's health and their children's health for years. Another woman, whose words were widely shared, wrote directly, "Who wants to get cancer? Who wants their children to get sick?" She said that someone's ambitions and decisions had once again proven more important than their safety. These are not opposition voices from Moscow. These are ordinary people in a Russian provincial city who watched their town turn toxic and concluded that their own government either could not protect them or was lying about the extent of the damage, or both. And Tuapse was not even the only story happening simultaneously. On May 1st and May 2nd, Ukraine struck an oil pumping station in Russia's Perm region, located more than 1,500 kilometers from Ukraine's border, for 2 consecutive days. The regional governor confirmed drone attacks on industrial facilities. Ukraine also struck the Lukoil refinery in Kstovo, which supplies roughly 30% of the Moscow region's gasoline supply. The Yaroslavl refinery near Moscow was hit. The Shishkari's terminal in Novorossiysk was targeted. The Caspian Pipeline Consortium facility was struck. And Ukraine hit the Baltic Sea export terminals at Ust-Luga and Primorsk, 2 of Russia's most critical oil export arteries, 3 times in a single week in late March 2026. Ust-Luga alone sits more than 800 kilometers from Ukraine. The governor of the St. Petersburg region was forced to publicly declare that the area around Russia's second largest city was now effectively a frontline region due to aerial threats. Let that sink in. The area around St. Petersburg, Russia's cultural capital, its second largest city, home to millions of people who were told this war was happening somewhere far away in Ukraine, is now being described by its own regional governor as a frontline zone. The strategic architecture behind Ukraine's oil campaign is not random. It is the product of years of systematic planning and a methodical campaign to first destroy the defensive shield that protected these targets, then strike the targets themselves repeatedly until they cannot recover. Between June 2025 and March 2026, Ukraine conducted confirmed engagements against 237 air defense-related targets, launchers, radars, and control systems, and struck 196 radar and electronic warfare systems. Each destroyed air defense battery opens a wider corridor for deeper strikes. Each disabled radar reduces the warning time available to Russian commanders. Russia's vast geographic size means that overlapping air defense coverage is exceptionally difficult to maintain, and individual losses can create total gaps over entire regions. Russia has been unwilling to redeploy air defense assets from the protective ring around Moscow, apparently more concerned with keeping the war's realities away from the regime's doorstep than with defending its oil infrastructure. And that unwillingness is now costing it billions. Ukraine's deep strike capability has also expanded at a rate that was not fully anticipated by Russian military planners. Ukraine's defense ministry confirmed that its forces have more than doubled the strike range of their drone systems since the full-scale invasion began in February 2022. The Ukhta oil refinery in Russia's Komi Republic, struck in February 2026, sits approximately 1,950 kilometers from Ukraine's border. The Perm region facilities sit over 1,500 kilometers away. Ukraine is now reaching targets in the geographic heart of Russia, not the borderlands, not the western periphery, but facilities that Russian energy executives had operated for decades under the assumption that they were untouchable. That assumption is gone. Ukraine launched more cross-border attack drones in March 2026 than Russia did. the first time in any single month that Ukraine outpaced Russia in drone launches since the full-scale invasion began. Ukraine deployed over 7,000 long-range systems in March alone, with some reaching 1,500 kilometers into Russian territory. The Atlantic Council confirmed that Ukraine's domestic drone industry, which was essentially non-existent 4 years ago, has become a production powerhouse and a world leader in drone warfare innovation. The acceleration is not slowing, it is compounding. Drone purchases in the first quarter of 2026 already exceeded more than half of all drone purchases made throughout all of 2025. New models are appearing regularly, featuring upgraded navigation, longer range, and enhanced resistance to Russian electronic warfare countermeasures. Now here is where the strategic picture gets genuinely complicated, and where honest analysis requires acknowledging the full picture rather than just the Ukrainian wins. The Middle East crisis of 2026, triggered by the U.S.-Israeli military action against Iran, and the subsequent closure of the Strait of Hormuz, sent global oil prices above $120 per barrel. This created an unexpected financial lifeline for Russia. Even as Ukraine destroyed its export capacity, the price of every surviving barrel Russia could ship nearly doubled. Russian oil export revenues, which had been collapsing, down 47% in the first 2 months of 2026, suddenly spiked. By March, rising prices meant Russia's monthly oil export revenues had almost doubled to around $19 billion. Ukraine's drone campaign was destroying infrastructure faster than Russia could repair it, but the market was compensating Russia for lower volumes with dramatically higher prices per barrel. Zelensky acknowledged this directly. He said that the strikes on Russian oil infrastructure are now even more crucial precisely because Moscow is collecting windfall profits from the global energy crisis linked to Iran. Ukraine's strategy has adapted accordingly. Rather than simply destroying refining capacity, Ukraine is now targeting the export terminals themselves, the specific choke points, through which oil must physically leave Russia and enter the global market. You can produce oil, but if you cannot load it onto a ship, you cannot sell it. Ust-Luga and Primorsk were attacked not because they are the largest facilities, but because they are the irreplaceable bottlenecks in Russia's oil export chain. And they are significantly harder to rebuild than they are to destroy. The reaction inside Russia to all of this is something the Kremlin is watching very carefully, and something that its domestic propaganda apparatus is visibly struggling to manage. The Tuapse environmental disaster has made the war viscerally real for millions of Russians who had previously experienced it only through state television's carefully filtered lens. When toxic black rain falls on your city, when your children's schools are closed because the air is poisoned, when your government tells you on national television that there are no serious threats while your regional authorities are simultaneously asking you to drink bottled water and stay indoors, that gap between official reality and lived reality is not something propaganda can close. Senior analysts tracking Russian public sentiment confirm that online communities are increasingly hostile and critical of the Putin regime in the wake of these strikes. Even some of the Kremlin's most ardent propagandists are beginning to hedge their public statements in ways that were unthinkable a year ago. Russia accused Ukraine of exacerbating the global energy crisis with its attacks on oil export hubs. The Kremlin threatened European leaders over their support for Ukraine's drone program. Putin called the strikes terrorist attacks against Russian civilians. None of it stopped Ukraine. Zelensky confirmed that Western partners had sent signals asking Ukraine to scale back the oil campaign due to concerns about the impact on global energy markets. Ukraine refused. The campaign continued and intensified. What is happening to Russia's oil lifeline in 2026 is not collateral damage. It is a deliberate, methodical, strategically coherent campaign designed to do exactly what it is doing: deprive the Kremlin of the financial oxygen that sustains its ability to wage this war. $7 billion lost in 4 months. A 16-year low in refinery capacity, a 40% temporary reduction in export capacity, black rain falling on Russian cities, residents asking publicly whether their children will get cancer, and a government that responds to all of it by saying on live television that there are no serious threats and that people are handling the challenges they face on the spot. Ukraine flew its drones deep inside Russia's $15 billion oil lifeline. And then this happened. Russia's own citizens began to see, for the first time in 4 years of war, that the story their government has been telling them is not the story that is actually unfolding outside their window. The scale of what Ukraine has built in 4 years, from a standing start with its cities under bombardment and its manufacturing base partially destroyed, is one of the most remarkable industrial stories of modern warfare. In 2022, Ukraine's domestic drone production was negligible. The country depended almost entirely on Western supplied systems and commercial off-the-shelf technology adapted for military use. Today, Ukraine operates what analysts at the Atlantic Council describe as a production powerhouse, a domestic drone industry that is not just supplying Ukraine's own military, but concluding joint venture agreements with European partners and exporting battlefield expertise to Gulf states that have signed cooperation agreements with Kyiv. The country that Russia invaded expecting to erase from the geopolitical map in 72 hours is now one of the world's foremost authorities on drone warfare doctrine, production, and operational employment. And the campaign is evolving faster than Russia can adapt to it. Ukraine's deep strike strategy began with targeting refineries. It expanded to pipelines and storage facilities. It moved to port infrastructure and export terminals. It has now incorporated shadow fleet tankers, the opaquely owned ships Russia uses to circumvent Western sanctions on its oil exports. On May 3, 2026, Zelensky confirmed that Ukrainian forces had struck 2 shadow fleet tankers at the entrance to the Black Sea port of Novorossiysk. He stated directly that these tankers had been actively used to transport oil and were not anymore. Ukraine is systematically targeting every node in Russia's oil export chain: the refineries that process the crude, the pipelines that move it, the terminals that load it onto ships, and now the ships themselves. It is not enough for Russia to produce oil if it cannot get the oil to market. Ukraine is making sure that Russia cannot. The Baker Institute for Public Policy, one of the most respected energy analysis institutions in the United States, laid out the strategic logic of this campaign with precision. Creating new shell companies and reflagging oil tankers is fast and relatively cheap. Replacing energy assets struck by steel and explosives is much slower and far more expensive. Recovery timeline modeling suggests a minimum of 18 to 24 months to restore major oil infrastructure assets to full operation, assuming uninterrupted reconstruction efforts and the availability of specialized equipment. Neither of those conditions is currently met in Russia. Sanctions restrict access to Western-made specialized equipment needed for refinery maintenance and reconstruction. Ukraine continues striking facilities before repairs can be completed. The Tuapse refinery had already been effectively offline from strikes in late 2025 before the April 2026 campaign began. Ukraine did not let it recover. It hit the same facility 4 times in 16 days, deliberately preventing any meaningful restoration of capacity. One former analyst, who spent decades studying how the Soviet Union and then Russia used its energy sector to support its military, was explicit about what this pattern represents. He said that 4 successful assaults on an important refinery complex have political effects as well as economic ones. He said that Moscow's attempts to hide what is happening from the public are feckless at best. He pointed out that everyone in Russia knows what is happening in Tuapse, and they can see that the Putin regime cannot or will not protect them. And then he said something that cuts to the heart of why Ukraine's oil campaign is historically significant beyond just the financial damage. He called it a sustained campaign designed to force Russia's war machine to a breaking point, not a campaign designed to win a news cycle, not a one-time dramatic strike for psychological effect. A sustained, compounding, relentless campaign that is designed to deny Russia the financial capacity to continue this war indefinitely. Russia's oil and gas revenues fund approximately 25 to 30% of its entire state budget. The mathematics of sustained disruption are merciless. At oil prices over $100 per barrel with 2 million barrels per day offline, Russia faces daily revenue losses of approximately $200 million. Sustained over a full year, that translates to potential losses approaching $73 billion annually, roughly 10% of Russia's total state budget revenue. Even if that figure is partially offset by higher prices on surviving exports, the structural damage to refining capacity, the extended downtime at struck facilities, and the mounting difficulty of acquiring replacement parts under sanctions conditions means that the compounding effect of Ukraine's campaign will continue to intensify regardless of what global oil prices do. And while Russia tries to calculate how to respond, Ukraine is already planning the next escalation. Ukraine's own defense executives confirmed to analysts that what you're seeing in these strikes is the template, the first example of a campaign design that will be replicated across multiple target sets simultaneously. Ukraine's growing arsenal of heavier strike missiles, the F-5 Flamingo, the Long Neptune, and domestically developed ballistic systems, carry warheads that are exponentially more destructive than the drone payloads currently used in the oil campaign. As production of these heavier system scales, Ukraine will be able to direct them at energy infrastructure targets in ways that create damage that is not weeks or months to repair, but permanently alters Russia's export capacity. Russia's oil lifeline is under systematic attack from a country that 4 years ago had no meaningful long-range strike capability at all. $7 billion lost, black rain falling on Russian resort cities, a 16-year low in refinery capacity, shadow fleet tankers being sunk at export ports, an air defense network being dismantled piece by piece to open corridors for deeper and deeper strikes, and a Russian population in affected cities beginning, cautiously, quietly, but undeniably, to ask whether their government's version of this war has any relationship to the reality falling from their sky. Ukraine flew deep into Russia's oil lifeline, and what happened next is only the beginning of what is coming.